Tom Kemper, who was my professor of neuropathology, and I described in one brain, followed by 5 additional brains later on, changes in the brain cortex associated with developmental dyslexia, and I'll tell you more about those. At the beginning, this was an amazing finding to people because, particularly teachers were trying to convince other educators, parents, funding organizations, the government, that dyslexia was a real thing. And even though dyslexia had been first described in the 1890s, first in Scotland and then in England and then in Germany, and it spread pretty quickly. For some reason, which has something to do with our culture, it wasn't real until you could show something about the brain, which is silly if you think about it. You can certainly describe aberrant characteristics at multiple levels, from the behavioral to the cognitive, to the brain-based at multiple levels, all the way down to the genetics. They're all legitimate ways of describing that something is different from something else. And they're all equally legitimate. I think the confusion there had to do with the history of science, which had been very strongly physical, anthropologically oriented in the 19th century, which led to a lot of problems. So back in the 19th century, people were talking about the size of the brain, the thickness of the cortex, as markers for one race being better than another race. That was during the time of the empires. The empires went away at the end of World War I, and suddenly people began to sort of abandon that concept of physical properties describing human beings, and they began to concentrate more about social pressures that define human beings, right? And that was between World War I and World War II. The onset of behaviorism. Socialism was a version of this, that people were not poor because they were inferior, they were poor because they didn't have social opportunities. So everything shifted that way. So it was sort of the tension between nurture and nature, where the way you were because of some natural characteristic about you that came through in the genes that made you superior or inferior to someone else because you had better or worse genes, or was it the issue that you were growing up in a society that discriminated against you? And that, of course, imply that all these reading disorders or any frailty that human beings can show could be learned instead of part of their innate structure. And we dealt with that until about the end of the Second World War, when suddenly people realized it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's a combination of both. And this is what this talk is all about, is a combination of both. Some characteristics of the brain that are set by genes early during brain development, which make you predisposed to certain behavioral characteristics that can be modified by modifying behavior, like teaching and changing the society, even changing the language you have to read. And there's the biological part that it's more difficult to change, actually, but it's potentially changeable too, so that you can decrease that predisposition to have this difficulty. Initially, of course, there were comparative studies that Bradley and Bryant showed, indicating that disabled readers perform less well than reading age-matched normal readers on sound categorization. They were showing some difficulty with how they understood, probably how they represented the sounds of the language in the brain, that there was a relationship between how well they understood these sounds and their ability to learn to read. So there was an association, at least. We couldn't tell at that time whether it was causal, because to prove cause is a more difficult challenge, but at least there was association such that if as a young child you showed some difficulty processing certain sounds of your language, you were likely to show problems with reading later on. And finally, which is very important to this audience, that if you actually taught to that sound processing, you practice categorizing sounds, you practice understanding the sound structure of the language, you could then make improvements in the reading ability later on. This is with the same brain. Whatever I'm going to tell you about brains and development, it's the same brain, but you can modify the impact of that different brain on the behavior that you're interested in, which is the ability for children to learn to read in childhood.